iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hello and welcome back to the iHeartPodcast Speaker Series. I'm Will Pearson, president of iHeartPodcast. As you know, we like to get together each week and talk to some of our favorite creators. I'm super excited about this week's conversation. We're talking to an advocate, a renowned speaker, a creator, somebody who sort of does it all and now can add to this. The creator or founder and executive producer of a new slate of podcasts for us. Also excited to talk about her new memoir. Like I said, she's up to many, many different things, but does them all well. Raquel Willis, thanks for spending some time with us.
Yes, thank you, Will, for having me on.
Raquel, you're always on the go. I'm curious, where have you been most recently? What have you been up to?
What have I been up to? Honestly enough, I have not been traveling outside of New York much, but I've been all over New York. It's what I call gala season. So there are a lot of nonprofits that I'm connected to that have had events. Last night was the Miss Foundation's event. So we had some powerful testimonies of like community advocates for women's rights and gender liberation. The Duchess and Duke of Sussex were there. So that was very interesting to be a table.
Not every day you're just hanging out with the Duke and Duchess.
Not at all. So that was cool. And then a few days ago was the GLAAD Media Awards. And I was excited that a powerful project I worked on with some amazing people at Logo TV and a bunch of like trans youth who are very powerful and ferocious. We won an award for the trans youth town hall. So it's been a great last few days.
Oh, that's huge. Congratulations. And it's been really fun to see all the recognition you've been getting for so much of the work you've done. You know, we mentioned at the top here that you've been a longtime advocate in the LGBTQ space. It was part of why we started these conversations because of much of your writing and other work in the community of LGBTQ youth and just individuals. And we wanted to start this slate of shows called Outspoken, dedicated to creators within the community. And you were the first person that we thought we need to reach out to and start talking about this to really try to build this up. And here we are. A few months ago, we announced Outspoken. We have an incredible roster of shows, and I want to talk a little bit about those. But I'm curious, what made you decide to jump in and join us as we decided to start Outspoken?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always been important for me to kind of marry together storytelling and social justice. Now, of course, our slate is not all activisty in the way that I may have been in my work and most of my career, but I do think that there's something here around elevating the voices of the marginalized that can't be understated. And especially in a time when the LGBTQ plus community is so discussed in news media, of course, discussed whether positively or negatively within politics, unfortunately, mostly negatively. We need more of these platforms for LGBTQ plus folks to speak authentically, to speak vulnerably, and to have our full lives shared with the world and not shared through someone else's lens. And so that was what was exciting about joining the team at Outspoken. Jay Brunson, Beth Ann Macoluso. I always butcher her name. My bad, Beth Ann. But yeah, so they have also just really been such a warm welcome wagon back into the iHeart space. So
yeah, we've been really excited to launch this, and some of the early conversations we talked about the fact that in building a slate like this, it's super important for us to recognize the diversity even within this slate of podcasts, that it's, that we can't launch, 2, 3, 4 podcasts and sort of call it a day, that we really need to think about the breadth here. Can you speak to that a little bit? Just sort of thinking about that as we, develop new programming across the slate.
Yeah, well, I think what I have often noticed is that we have this kind of tendency to have these cycles of saying we're going to support communities on the margins, support creators on the margins. And then unfortunately, those resources may dry up, after maybe a season. And I've experienced that in various roles. Most of the LGBTQ people that I know, brilliant people, have experienced that as well. And so I think what we miss is that it's not about just one time amplifying a voice or a perspective. It's about a long-term investment in amplifying that person, but also understanding that it's just not simply about the amplification. It's also about resourcing and expanding the wealth of resources available to that person on the margins, because oftentimes we're facing more barriers when it comes to building up our platforms or building up our space in the professional sphere. So I think that's what it is. It's a long-term commitment, and that's also what I was excited about in joining Outspoken.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we, every single month we want to keep building, keep adding, keep growing. And as we think about the mix, one of the things that we've talked about is you try to find this balance of course, you need some big names in the space in order to draw attention to what we're doing and to give promotion to some of the other shows. But then a big part of the mission is trying to elevate new voices, trying to make sure that we're breaking new creators into the space and giving opportunities to those that have great ideas. They're super talented. They may not have, 5 million social media followers or something like that, but could you talk just a little bit about some of the balance of the shows that we have, maybe even, pointing out some of the shows that we have in the slate?
Yeah. So one thing, that I'm so excited that you brought up is that it is that balance of having these bigger names who can, draw more attention onto the work that we're doing, but also using that positioning to elevate lesser known folks, right? Who are still doing very brilliant and powerful work. We're lucky on our slate that we had a lot of creators who were already doing powerful things. So we have, our partnerships with groups like Big Money Players.
Right, Will Ferrell's network. Yeah.
Yes, and School of Humans and so many others. So we had shows like Las Culturistas, who, if you're in podcasting at all, there's no way to ignore the powerful platform that they have built. But we also have had some important debuts this year, like Rosie O'Donnell is back, right, with Onward. She's such a titan of LGBTQ representation for me as a kid in the 90s. So I love that we're able to pay it forward. Also Frosted Tips with Lance Bass, who doesn't love a little boy band connection. So that's great. And then more recently, we've had the best podcast ever with Raven Simone and Miranda. So we have some of these big names. And I think it's also important to think about those particular figures, right? Because they have had these long careers where there was a point where maybe they weren't able to openly share their full truths, right? And so I think it's so beautiful that we have this platform now that not only is bringing in new creators, but also offering opportunity for folks who have not had that support in their fullness throughout their careers. And those three in particular showcase that. And then, of course, we have folks like Laverne Cox and Roseanne Gay who are in the mix as well. So we have those powerful creators, but I'm also excited, of course, about a forthcoming podcast by an amazing young creator named Jordan Gonzalez, who I actually randomly met on the street walking to the Brooklyn Museum like 2 weeks ago.
You're kidding. Wow.
Yeah, they were just like on the street. They were like, Raquel. I was like, hi. They actually just graduated from higher ed. So that's exciting, and their podcast is going to be coming out soonish.
Yeah.
And focused on LGBTQ plus love stories throughout history. So that's amazing. And then we also have other talent like Woke AF, led by the incomparable Danielle Moody.
Great podcast.
Yeah, just so unapologetic in how she talks about the current state of politics. She actually was the host of the Miss Foundation Gala last night. So I saw her in the mix too. So it's a community affair. We're in spaces with folks all the time, and I'm excited that we get to bring some of that warmth into this space.
Yeah, fantastic. And so you're not only an executive producer on the Slate, but you're also a creator and of a couple of shows. Can you talk a little bit about the shows that you've been working on?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to say that I am so blessed to have such strong invested teams. And so we've kind of been in the mix. It's also been a busy time on that front as well, kind of gearing up with the recording of both of those podcasts. So the first is adapting the Trans Obituaries Project, which I created as an editorial project when I was executive editor at Out Magazine. The center of that story is talking about the epidemic of violence that often plagues Black and Brown trans women. The story of a young trans Latina named Leela. I'm thinking of another young trans girl who completely changed my lens, Leela Alcorn, who died by suicide in 2014. This story is about Layleen Polanco, 27-year-old who died in Rikers custody, and kind of the movement that she sparked through her experience there. So just working with a powerful team. I'm working with Dylan Hewer and Joey Pat, who are in the iHeart fam, and they are doing such phenomenal research and doing a great job with the casting and everything. So got a great team there. And then my other team is with Queer Diaries, which is a show elevating the experiences of young queer youth in states that have a lot of this anti-LGBTQ legislation moving there. And so working with Julia Furlan and Jordan Bailey. And so we're having a great time, even though we are kind of holding, the complexity of tragedy and transformation and joy with all of these stories. So we're going to be releasing some big ones this year, and I'm so excited that iHeart has taken me back into the fold to try and make all of this happen.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled to have you here, and those are two super important projects that we're honored to be a part of, and much more to come. I did mention earlier that you've been working on a memoir, and this must have been just a huge undertaking. I can't imagine what it's like to go through this process, and it will release in the fall of this year. But can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what led you to decide? I mean, you've led a super interesting life, and even though you're still quite young, you've led a very interesting life to this point, and those experiences are certainly worthy of sharing. But I'm curious, sort of what led you to the decision to write this, and what's it been like?
Yeah, I'll be 32 next year, just to put it in reference for folks. Next week.
That's right.
In reference. The memoir writing process, I just don't think that there's really any way to prepare for it. You kind of go through all of these different cycles, which I think people realize. You have your revisions and everything. You're trying to just get as much as you can on the page, and then for me as a writer, it's kind of like getting all the clay down and then kind of chiseling away at, okay, well, what is the story that we're excavating here? And The Risk It Takes to Bloom on Life and Liberation is about my experience growing up as a young Black kid in the American South in Augusta, Georgia, trying to understand, well, why do I feel so out of place? Why do I feel, different from other kids? Lo and behold, it was because I was transgender, and that was something that I didn't really have language for until I was in college at the University of Georgia. But along the way, I at least acknowledged my queerness as much as I could in my youth, and my parents, very traditional Black Catholic parents. I was very blessed to come from a two-parent, middle class household, and also had all of these expectations that I was just not cut out to fit into. And so I had to really work with them to figure out, well, what is my path going to be? And yeah, I dealt with some experiences like my father passing away, which was kind of a catalyst for me to dig deeper into my identity and own it. And that's kind of the first half. And then the second half is really my experience as a fully realized Black trans woman trying to figure out what my media career could be in the middle of the rise of the movement for Black lives, the rise of transgender visibility, the rise of public discussions about feminism in a new way.
Yeah.
So that's it in a nutshell. I can't believe I even got it that short this time.
I honestly, I cannot wait to read it. And I can imagine how powerful and helpful it will be for so many others to read the memoir. And as we think sort of back to the podcast slate, the role that shows and conversations can play for, we think about Gen Z, or we think about, younger people that are going through their own sort of self-discovery and just exploration and thought. And as stressful as youth can be, as it is, to also know that you're dealing with things that sometimes society doesn't make any easier for all of us, right? And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the role that you think some of these podcasts can play in society, and for specifically a younger generation, in a way that maybe you or anyone older didn't have access to when you were growing up. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the kind of talking points we hear a lot right now is the rise in LGBTQ identification by Gen Z. So they are by and far the most queer, the most trans, the most non-binary generation to exist. And there are stats that hover between 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 Gen Z adults identify within the community. And I think we're going to continue to see more and more folks embrace their identities, and that's a big part of it. So I think, to your point, we are in a particular time where the Gen Z is kind of able to reap some of the benefits of visibility in terms of like over, and I'll say this as someone from born in the 90s, who experienced that, you know, for Gen Z, there's a lot more opportunity to share your truth. But with that comes being more of a target in a way. I often get the question, do I think it's easier to be openly trans now than, say, 10 years ago when I first shared my truth in college? And I think that's hard to say, because at least then, I didn't have so many eyes on me. I didn't have such political baggage, all of these kind of stereotypes, tropes, and assumptions about who I am. And I think that is what our podcasts have an opportunity to kind of cut off, is that those ideas of stereotypes, right? We actually have an opportunity here to expand the palette of stories. And so when someone meets a trans person or meets a queer person, we don't want them to think that they know the story, because they don't. We're all individuals. And our podcasts are just giving folks more colors to play with on that palette to understand other folks that they don't know.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I love the start that we're off to. It's an amazing roster of podcasts, but I think the thing that's that much more exciting is that there's so much more to come. We're going to be launching dozens more podcasts over the next year or so, with more to come after that, of course. But we genuinely appreciate your leadership, your involvement, everything that you're doing here within iHeart and to help launch and grow Outspoken. And wish you the best as you try to wrap up this work on this memoir. I know it's not easy, but Raquel, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you again next week.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.